10 Strongest Dwarves in The Lord of the Rings. The 10 strongest dwarves in The Lord of the Rings are some of fantasy's best heroes. Dwarves are one of the many species invented by high fantasy master J.R.R. Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings. The masterpiece published in 3 parts between 1954 and 1955. They were adapted by Peter Jackson in his famous Hobbit and Lord of the Rings trilogies, with each movie adapting a part of the novel. From part 1 of the novel and Jackson's first movie, The Fellowship of the Ring, Gimli, son of Gloin, gave the dwarves a strong presence in the story. But Gimli is just the best-known dwarf of heroic stature in The Lord of the Rings, with plenty of others spread across the legendarium. Tolkien's first Loder release was actually based on dwarves, that being The Hobbit, published in 1937. The hardy dwarves only grew in lore and legend from there on out, coming to lead many tales in the Silmarillion and the history of Middle-earth, and even to star in Amazon Prime Video's The Rings of Power Season 1 in 2022. Rings of Power's Durin remained a main character ever since, proving the breadth and diversity of dwarf heroes in Loder. Thror was the beleaguered dwarf hero who was thrust from his home by Smaug the Golden in the year 2770 of the Third Age. Not only did he survive an attack by one of Lord of the Rings' 4 named dragons, but he led his people to safety. However, Thror had been a hero even before that. Orphaned by a cold drake, Thror and his brothers had guided their civilization from the dangerous Grey Mountains to Erebor, only for Erebor, too, to be destroyed by a dragon. Thror was a holder of one of Lord of the Rings' dwarf rings of power, fighting against its corrupting effect to keep his sanity. He also created the famous map of the Lonely Mountain that Bilbo and Thorin followed. Following the exodus from Erebor, Thror continued exploring, seeking to better the lives of his impoverished folk. He traveled to the entrance of Moria, which was to be his undoing. Unfortunately for Thror, Moria had been occupied, and he left Moria headless, courtesy of Azog the Orc. One of the Lord of the Rings rings of power with the most intriguing journeys, Thror's dwarven ring was passed to Thrin II, his son. On hearing of his father's death, Thrin, the new king, was furious. He waged the War of the Dwarves and Orcs to attempt to neutralize the threat of the Orcs. Uniting many dwarf clans under his banner, Thrin was successful and Azog was slain. Moria was still occupied by Durin's Bane, the Balrog, and Thrin still wasn't content scratching out a living in Dunland. So he took his followers to the Blue Mountains. All the while, his mind was being consumed by the ring. He disappeared one day and was never seen again until Gandalf found him in Dol Guldur. Sauron had captured and tortured Thrin, reclaiming the ring and ending the life of one of the dwarves' great kings. Durin was another victim of Sauron's Rings of Power scheme, and like Thror and Thrin, he put up a good fight against his ring's all-consuming power while ruling a kingdom. Durin was masterfully portrayed in Amazon Prime Video's The Lord of the Rings. The Rings of Power by Scottish actor Peter Mullen. Durin guided his race through a time of prosperity, including being the first dwarf to receive a Ring of Power. Michael Mizrahi portrayed the older Thrin in The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug. Durin had crafted a positive relationship with the elves of Eregion, which precipitated their offer of a Ring of Power. Despite the poisonous ring, Durin's friendship with the elves had a strong and lasting effect on the success of both species for a long time. Once Sauron's fair form was revealed as a disguise in Eregion and the elves stopped working with him, in shock and horror, Sauron invaded Eregion. Durin sent troops to aid Eregion, allowing Elrond to escape to Rivendell. Asakol was a first-age dwarvish hero who fought against Morgoth with the elves and men in the War of the Jewels. Morgoth was the Lord of the Rings' first villain, and he was the enemy of Belegost in the First Age. Azakol joined the Union of Maedhros, a unique and brave alliance of men, elves, and dwarves led by Noldor Prince Maedhros. As a part of the Union of Maedhros, Azakal and his dwarves played a major role in the Nernath Arneodiad. The story of the Nernath Arneodiad is told in the Silmarillion. The Nernath Arneodiad was also known as the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. It didn't go well for the Union of Maedhros, but it would have gone much worse had it not been for the dwarves' ancient armor creation. Azakal and his dwarves wore fire-retardant helms that helped them withstand dragon fire. The evil dragon Glorung was present at the battle, and Azakal gave his life taking him down. Attacking Glorung, Azakal was struck down, but Glorung fled the field with many of his followers. The main dwarf hero of Peter Jackson's The Hobbit movies and their source material, Thorin Oakenshield overcame a lot to end up a good man and a good king. As his father and grandfather had been poisoned by their ring of power, Thorin became poisoned by lust for the Arkenstone. It temporarily diverted his noble goals during his mission with Bilbo and his company to reclaim Erebor. Thorin retook Erebor but lost his life in the process. But through it all, Thorin stood strong and led his small team on an incredibly difficult mission, bravely facing Smaug. Once Smaug was killed, Thorin and his company faced the Battle of 5 Armies. Never one to sit out the action, Thorin leaped from the front gate and fought a winning battle. However, like Fili and Kili, he martyred himself for this cause. Thorin retook Erebor but lost his life in the process. In his final words, he appeared to relinquish the greed that had taken hold of him, finding peace. Durin VII was known as Durin the Last and was the last great Durin in a long line of legendary kings. Durin VII wasn't a main character in The Lord of the Rings, but was referenced in the appendices. Here, it was told how Durin VII eventually led Durin's folk back from Erebor to Khazad-dûm, finally re-establishing their glorious realm of old. This had been a long time coming. Durin VII was the final reincarnation of Durin the Deathless, and he was the last great figure in dwarf lore. As the elves came to fade in Middle-earth, giving way to the Age of Men, so too did the dwarves. Despite centuries of conflict with Morgoth and Sauron, plus hostility with the elves, Durin VII ended the dwarves' time on Arda with peace, wealth, and positive relations with other species. The Lord of the Rings' most famous dwarf, Gimli, only carried out a fraction of his heroics in the main body of the Lord of the Rings text. As told in Tolkien's novel and shown in Jackson's movies, Gimli joined the prestigious Fellowship of the Ring in accompanying Frodo on his mission to save the world, ridding it of Sauron's One Ring, and therefore, Sauron himself. Gimli fought bravely in the War of the Ring, defending the good people of Middle-earth from Sauron's looming threat. But Gimli's true Lord of the Rings destiny was revealed in the novel's appendices. After proving to dwarves and elves that the species could once again overcome their differences, in the form of his friendship with Legolas, Gimli went traveling with the elf. This friendship was the Third Age equivalent of Celebrimbor's relationship with Narvi, establishing support where previously there was enmity. After visiting the glittering caves of Aglarond with Legolas, Gimli colonized the area, becoming Lord and going on to help rebuild Gondor after the War of the Ring. Din Hiu Ironfoot was a renowned warrior. Din joined the War of the Dwarves and Orcs with his father, Nin, at the tender age of 32. This was very young for a dwarf. Heroically, he defeated Azog at the gates of Moria, motivated by the rage of watching Azog slay his father. Wise as well as strong, Din dissuaded Thranduil from entering Moria, knowing the Balrog awaited. Din became Lord of the Iron Hills in his father's stead, and eventually joined the Battle of 5 Armies, assisting Thorin, elves, and men in defeating an onslaught of orcs and wargs. After Thorin's death, Din succeeded him as king under the mountain and king of Durin's folk. Even more commendably, Din sent a ring wraith packing when it came knocking many years later, asking for Bilbo's whereabouts. Telchar may be the most famous dwarvish smith, and the dwarves were very famous for their smithing. Telchar forged Narsil, the sword that Elendil used to beat Sauron in the War of the Last Alliance. This victory was so cataclysmic that it ended the Second Age and started the Third. Narsil was broken under Elendil in the fight. These were the shards that Aragorn agonized over in the Fellowship of the Ring movie, and that were reforged into Anduril, the Flame of the West. In essence, neither the War of the Last Alliance nor the War of the Ring could have been won without Telchar. Telchar made the dragon helm of Dor-lómin, which was famously worn by Turin in the Silmarillion. Also, Angrist, the knife that Luthien and Beren used to pry a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown, was forged by Telchar. The dwarvish equivalent of the elves' greatest smith, Celebrimbor, Telchar saved Middle-earth, indirectly, more than once. In essence, neither the War of the Last Alliance nor the War of the Ring could have been won without Telchar. Although it may seem harsh to claim that the dwarves peaked at the first ever member of their race, and it was all downhill from there, there are good reasons why Durin the Deathless may just be the greatest dwarf to have ever lived. The first dwarf and the eldest of the fathers of the dwarves to awaken, Durin the Deathless was created by one of Lord of the Rings' 15 Valor, by Alle himself. And despite his moniker, he did eventually die but lived for longer than any other dwarf in recorded history. Durin the Deathless put this time to good use, carving out a place for the dwarves in Khazad-dûm. Durin-I's reign was considered a golden age in dwarf lore, with centuries of peaceful mining, culture, and growth generated in his era. Dwarves of future generations would have multiple threats to contend with. Multiple myths exist in the Lord of the Rings legendarium of Durin's deathlessness. Not just very long-lived, Durin was said to reincarnate into subsequent generations, and in some legends, back into his own body.